And for more on the search, we're joined by Seth Kaplan. He's in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He's also the managing partner for Airline Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of the Australian Prime Minister's comments on Friday? Seemed very optimistic.
He did, although tempered somewhat by comments from none other than Angus Houston, who's actually in charge of the search for Australia. So you have the Prime Minister seeming very confident, and the person actually in charge of the search sort of walking back the Prime Minister's comments just a bit and saying, look, we're not all that close yet. You know, on one hand, you have these apparent signals which should be unmistakably from the black boxes, this 37.5 kilohertz signal, which is designed precisely to not sound like anything else. On the other hand, it would be really incredible to be that close, to be within the couple miles that they would need to be of the black boxes when you still have a 20,000 square mile or so search area this soon after the incident.
And Seth, you said apparent signals, and that's interesting because this fifth ping that was talked about appears to have not come from the missing jet. What are the chances the batteries are dying or are dead, and how much more complicated does this search effort become if that is the case?
Precisely, Mike. You know, if anything, the fact that we know that there have been false positives, that fifth ping, for example, shows that, you know, it's possible to have something seem like it and then not be it. It doesn't prove that the others are that, and of course we all hope they indeed are, but if one can show some hope and then not be, the others can as well. In terms of the batteries, you know, remember these batteries are rated for 30 days. You and I have talked in the past about the fact that that doesn't mean that they die on the 31st day, but on the other hand, you do hit a point somewhere, about 40 or 45 days out where it would be unlikely for them to continue working, and then you're dealing with a very different kind of search.
And let's talk a little bit about Bluefin 21. We have some imagery of it, some animation. Talk to us about the role it will play. Will it become central to this search as we go forward, do you believe?
Exactly, Mike. And, you know, fortunate that we have that sort of technology nowadays. You and I have talked in the past about Air France Flight 447, for example, off the coast of Brazil. You know, another incident from a lot longer rather ago also comes to mind. There was South African Airways Flight 295 on its way from Taipei to Johannesburg via Mauritius about a quarter century ago, which tragically crashed in the Indian Ocean, and in fact at a depth even a bit deeper than we think this wreckage might be at. That was more than 3 miles deep. The pingers had stopped working, and about a year and a half later, they managed to find the cockpit voice recorder, although in that case, never the data recorder. So even with that that quarter-century-old technology, they managed to find that back then. So yes, Bluefin 21 and other very modern technology, much better imagery, side-scanning sonar that takes rather good pictures of the ocean floor would come into play. Although, again, you know, even when we talk about those past incidents, whether it's South African Airways or Air France or others, those were all incidences where we had a much better idea of where those aircraft went down. So that remains the challenge here, that we can only hope that they have indeed narrowed the search area down as much as Prime Minister Abbott is confident that they have.
And Seth, locating the flight data recorders, the wreckage, that's just one part of this. Recovering it, though, will take a lengthy period of time, won't it?
Oh, it sure will, absolutely. Again, those other incidents that we mentioned were ones where they had a pretty good idea of where it was, and then once they more or less had narrowed it down to within, you know, a few hundred yards, it still took some time when you're talking about bringing something, in this case, up from nearly 3 miles down. So exactly that recovery mission where you're dealing with submarines that of the sort that can go that far down, because, by the way, most manned submarines don't go that far under the surface. So you're dealing with some very specialized equipment. Then that'll take time. And even then, Mike, as we've discussed before as well, you're still dealing with a voice recorder that will only have worked for the final 2 hours of the flight. So we won't even have on the voice recorder when the incident began. The possibility then existing that, you know, if you had one person acting alone in the cockpit, unless that person was literally talking to themselves, we might not hear very much useful information on the voice recorder, whereas the data recorder, at least on a much longer loop, and would give us some useful information, but a long, long way before we're even dealing with analyzing anything on recorders that we certainly haven't found, nor, as you said, brought to the surface.
Seth, a year after the 9/11 tragedy, I did a story on the fact that it was the worst day in aviation history, but also one of its greatest milestones in the fact that all these airlines were able to ground their fleets, bring them down. It had never happened before. Are we likely to look at this in much the same way as an enormous tragedy, and yet it brought all these countries together in doing this search, which has been quite an undertaking?
Indeed, it has, and Angus Houston, who we mentioned a moment ago in a different context, also emphasized how appreciative he was, in particular, of China's efforts, for example, as well as those other countries that have been involved, the U.S. and the U.K., for example, and Malaysia. Yeah, so it could indeed do that. On one hand, this is also strange. It's such a one-off that it's hard to say whether it'll have any very broad lessons for the industry. But one, certainly, if in fact this is what causes us to eventually have the voice and data streaming via satellite, for example, to somewhere else in the cloud and on the ground, as opposed to having to do this very archaic search for these black boxes, that would take a lot of money and resources and a lot of discussion about who would pay for that. Would it be airlines? Would it be governments or somebody else? But if in fact that happens someday as a result of this, then certainly the industry and passengers would have this incident for all of the bad that it's done to thank for that.
Seth Kaplan joining us from Fort Lauderdale. Thanks so much.